Good afternoon. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Today is September 2nd. It's a Wednesday afternoon, a gorgeous day in Springfield. And it's my pleasure to be with Governor Edgar this afternoon. How are you, Governor?
Good afternoon.
This is part of a continuing series that we've been doing at the library with Governor Edgar. This is actually the 9th session that we've had with the governor, but we decided to do something a little bit different for this one. Because the subject for today's interview is the 1990 gubernatorial election. And Governor, you've told me several times that this is a classic election, so we wanted to do something a little bit special in that regard. So thank you again for agreeing to come here, and we're looking forward to it. Last time we talked, we left off with a discussion about your call that you got from Governor Thompson telling you that it was your turn.
It was in July of 1989, 20 years ago, and I was on my way out to the Secretary of State Convention in Vail, Colorado, of which I was the president of. And the last thing before I got on the plane, I talked to Governor Thompson. He told me that in a few minutes he was going to announce he was not going to run for re-election, and that the term he used, "It's yours." And I think everyone kind of figured I was the heir apparent, at least on the Republican side, that I would be the Republican candidate for governor. So as Brenda and I flew to Colorado, I don't know if I noticed the flight. I mean, this was something you knew, you hoped eventually this opportunity would come, and it did. And now that it was coming, my mind was racing on all the things I needed to do and all the concerns and worry, because I knew it was going to be a tough campaign. I thought at that point pretty much it was going to be I'd be the Republican nominee, and Neil Hartigan, the Attorney General, would be the Democratic candidate, and it would be a barn burner, and it turned out to be that. When we landed in Colorado, I got a hold of my staff back in Illinois, and I think I'd called Mike Lawrence, my press secretary, right before I left, and he knew what was happening. And of course, Governor Thompson had his press conference while I was flying, and we began to talk strategy, and right away they had calls from Chicago television that wanted to come and interview me. Well, a little bit of a dilemma. I wanted them to interview me, but I didn't necessarily want them to interview me, and everybody knows I'm in Vail, Colorado. What are you doing in Vail, Colorado on some kind of junket? And so the agreement I had, they could interview me, but they couldn't have the mountains in the background. They just interviewed me inside our hotel room, and just didn't make any mention necessarily where I was. So they all contracted with local television stations in Denver that came out to Vail and interviewed me on what I thought. And also, while this was going on, we had our people out talking with party people around the state, making sure everybody was going to be on board whenever I did announce. And so there was a lot of things going on as we drove into Vail, Colorado, and spent the next 2 or 3 days trying to preside over a meeting, but also trying to lock down a nomination for governor back in Illinois. And we thought we had a pretty good open field at that point of anyone, at least we thought would be a credible candidate. George Ryan and I had already had a discussion about I would run for governor and he'd run for Secretary of State, because that was important, because for the previous year and a half, well, no, it wasn't even a year and a half, just a little over a half year, George Bush the elder had been president, and there was always speculation and rumors that Governor Thompson might be named to his cabinet, or the FBI post came open, they might name him head of the FBI, and if he left, then George Ryan would become governor, and that would completely change the political landscape. Whereas most people viewed that I was the heir apparent to be the Republican nominee for governor. If George would become governor, then he would be the likely candidate. He'd only have a few months. You'd still be in a honeymoon, and undoubtedly he would be the candidate for governor. So when we got together, this was in late spring, probably sometime maybe in May or June. It was pretty obvious Thompson probably wasn't going to the cabinet. So George Ryan was willing to kind of settle for Secretary of State, and the party chairman around the state kind of thought that made sense. He ought to, not try to run for governor, maybe goes for Secretary of State and I go for governor. So when we got together and kind of reached that agreement, I think many of the party leaders around the state were in agreement with that. So I knew that I didn't have to worry about George Ryan. In fact, he indicated that if I ran for governor, he would run for Secretary of State after Governor Thompson made his announcement. Then word came that Donald Rumsfeld, who had not really been around Illinois politics for a long time, but who had been a former congressman and then chief of staff for President Ford, and he was maybe interested in running for governor. And this was kind of out of the blue. I mean,
Most people even forgot that he ever came from Illinois.
Yeah, but the insiders knew, and here's a person, the media, this is a big name, and it just kind of stunned me. I never thought about him having any interest in, because he had never been involved in state politics. So I'm still out in Vail running my meeting, and I'm making calls back to Illinois, talking with people who were going to talk to people that talked to Rumsfeld. And in fact, I think he had been on a raft trip with Dick Cheney, his former assistant, and Bob Teeters, who was one of my political consultants, who also was President Bush's political consultant. And they were on a raft trip out in Wyoming, so when he got back, he was going to think about it. And so he got back, I think, on a Sunday night, and his people had a conference. And some of his people had talked to some of my people, and they didn't think it made a lot of sense. He didn't have, he had no understanding of Illinois that much, the state, and the political nuances or some of the issues. I mean, they didn't think he would probably be real excited about worrying about a bridge down in Saline County or something like that. So they kind of counseled him that probably didn't make a lot of sense. Plus, undoubtedly there'd be a pretty tough primary battle because, while he would have been a formidable candidate, I think most people still figured I had the edge. Then he announced the next day that he wasn't interested in running for governor. So that pretty well, I thought, locked up the nomination. And I have to say that at that point, I could then enjoy the Secretary of State meeting. In fact, it was ironic. The day before he made that call, our special guest was Gerald Ford, because we were in Vail, and that was his summer home. And I made some mention about, that one of his former people might be running, and he kind of chuckled. He didn't offer any advice or help, but he chuckled. So within 3 days, at least in the Republican political establishment, and I think in the media, it was pretty much foregone conclusion, I would be the Republican nominee. Now, I later did have a primary opponent, and we'll talk about that a little later, but that kind of gave me a little breathing room because I knew we still wanted to do the official announcement, but we wanted to stage it just right. Also, I had a week vacation coming in Colorado, and I figured I better take it because I may not get one for a while. So we stayed in Colorado for another week, and my staff was back putting together the plans for an announcement, which came then in, I think, the 8th or 9th of August. Now, in the meantime...
Wanted to ask you before you got too far and put you on the spot. Why was Thompson supporting you rather than Ryan?
Well, I think, again, it was just kind of taken for granted that I would be the person. Name recognition, Secretary of State's much more visible than Lieutenant Governor. I think the polls indicated that. But he, again, I think it was just kind of taken for granted that the way it would be. I had worked for him on his staff before I had become Secretary of State. I mean, there's a quote I think we talked about earlier session, and I saw he had it in a book I read recently on George Ryan, that when he convinced me to come and work for him, he said, we'll put you in line to be governor. And So I think it just in everyone's mind, it was just this is what I was after Secretary of State. I was going to run for governor, and he was in agreement with that.
Okay.
There was never any question, I don't think, on that. So I get back to Illinois, and we're planning the fly around. But I'm also spending time. What I spent a lot of time during early on that campaign, talking to people, business leaders, trying to line up support, line up money. Work with groups around the state that we'd already worked with. While the year before as Secretary of State, I had a lot of the various state association boards of directors into my office in the Secretary of State's office, had lunch with them, got to know them, began to make them feel comfortable with me, so when this campaign came along, they would feel like they knew me, and hopefully they would support me.
This is going on before the formal announcement?
Yeah. Everybody knew I was going to announce, but I wanted to get out and about and try to get people lined up to be with me, put together committees and things. So I spent a lot of my time then and really for the next 3 or 4 months just meeting one-on-one with leaders in the state, a lot of business leaders, but also ethnic leaders and association leaders and things, kind of to begin to put the campaign together. I probably was spending more time focusing on what I thought it was going to take to win the general election than worrying about a primary challenge. Now, at that point, it didn't look like we were going to have a primary challenge. We did have one later, but my sense was this was going to be a tough election come 1990. We knew historically when you have the White House, the off-year election is a tougher election for the party with the White House, so we knew we'd probably have a backlash there. Also, I had began to pick up, though not to the degree that I realized a year later, that people wanted a change. I mean, Jim Thompson had been governor for 14 years, and so that was a long time in Illinois for one party to hold on to the governor's mansion. And so there was, beginning to be some restlessness, and we want to change. So you had to begin to think about how do you get identified as change. At the same time, you're a Republican and you're an ally of the current governor. So those things were beginning to happen, but also working on what was I going to say at announcement, began to focus on some of the themes we wanted to talk about in a campaign, knowing that was going to be probably one of the best media opportunities I would have for several months in this campaign. And we wanted to start the campaign off very positive. We wanted to get as big as bang as we could in that opening announcement, because we knew we were going to have television coverage all over the state, particularly in Chicago, which was important. And we just wanted people to have a positive attitude about the campaign from the word go. So we spent a lot of time on the speech, spent a lot of time planning the announcement day. I mean, I'm one who likes to get involved in that stuff. I'm my own scheduler, my schedulers always would point out. And so we wanted to hit as many places as possible, and we wanted rallies, we wanted a good crowd, we wanted a good setting, and we wanted to have the right people there. And so that took a lot of planning, because we had, I think we had 6 stops that day. So we started out in my hometown of Charleston, which I wanted to do. I wanted to start there. And we had the announcement on the campus of Eastern Illinois University, where I'd gone to school, very, very close to. And then from there, we flew down to Southern Illinois. We went to Marion. Now, in Charleston, we announced we also, not only that was going to be, I would gave the speech 6 times that day. So,
well, I have the press release right here, as a matter of fact.
Okay, well, you probably remember better than I do if you have the press release, but I got tired of hearing it. But that first, we knew it was important. I also had, because one of our themes was going to be education and children and all, and Ted Sanders, who had been the state superintendent of schools and had just gone to the Bush administration as the number 2 person in the Department of Education. He was, I think, Deputy Secretary of Education. He came back to introduce me both in Charleston and later in Springfield, and to kind of dramatize my concern about education. So,
if you don't mind, I can read a couple quotes from the announcement that kind of help frame this. We can assure that Illinois has an educational system that is second to none in our nation, an educational system that will help attract and keep good jobs, an education system that will encourage our children to stay in Illinois and raise our grandchildren here, a system that will assure that Illinois is a state prosperous enough to meet the needs of the truly needy and to bring them into the mainstream of our society. And here was another quote that I thought was a little bit revealing and certain the framework of how you were thinking about things. You said, "All politicians want to be popular. I'm no exception. But it's more important to me that I do my duty as I see it, and that I keep faith with the principles that have guided me through my years of public service." Does that sound about right?
Mm-hmm. That sounds about right, yeah. Yeah, the speech was much longer. I know nobody should think they got off that easy back in August of 1989. But we had a great turnout at the campus, and the night before we had we were well organized. That was very important to me that we organized, and I thought we organized well. But the night before, we'd had all the media in, particularly the Chicago television media and the newspapers, because in Charleston, to see where I grew up, we had a cookout at the park, Morton Park, which also appears in the first ad, I think, that we did. But I did some one-on-one interviews with people that night. Then we took them over to show them our house where I lived in Charleston, which was a very modest ranch house. Which
You were hoping to get on the evening news, perhaps?
Well, we did, I think, got on the evening news, yeah, because we had a satellite. We hired a satellite truck to come in, and that got all the neighbors in my mother's neighborhood all excited because that's a pretty big thing, so they could uplink their stories back to Chicago. We wanted to get every free moment we could on Chicago television, which is always the name of the game in Illinois politics, is getting on Chicago television, because 2/3 of the state's population watches Chicago television. So I thought that went well. The announcement in Charleston went well. Then we went down to Marion, where I remember they had this huge balloon down there, and we had several thousands of people there too. It turned out to be a beautiful day. We had leased a jet from Ozark Airline. That was an airline that existed back then. It was DC-9. It was a big plane. It cost a lot of money, I remember. And we took a lot of people with us. We also planned on who would fly with us. And we'd have people fly so far, then we would change. They'd get off, and other people would get on. But again, we wanted to use that for potential supporters, particularly financial supporters, also political leaders, people that were influential, and people who had been very supportive over the years. Remember, I had Governor Stratton flew with us. I don't think I don't know if he'd ever done a fly around, because he used a helicopter back when he ran for governor a few times, but he hadn't been around in all those places probably since he left office 30 years before. So it was fun to have him. But we had a whole group of folks with us. And the press, we had the press, some of them would get a fly for 2 stops and we'd change, and some other press people would get on. So Brenda and I and our 2 children were on the flight. My mother wasn't well at that time. She had trouble. She was with us in Charleston, but she didn't do the fly around. So we went to Marion, again, had a great crowd. It was a beautiful day. The weather is the other thing I was worried about, because all these were outdoor rallies, except the one in Charleston was in the Student Union, I think, and then the one in Chicago, in Rosemont, was in a auditorium. But the rest were going to be kind of outside, or maybe in a hangar if we had to. But so the Marion, then we went from Marion to over near Alton. Then from Alton, we had to get to Springfield. We wanted to get to Springfield for the big rally downtown at the Capitol building during noon hour.
The current Capitol building or the old Capitol?
The current Capitol building. We had them in Rotunda. That was always
Okay.
where we had our rallies. And we wanted to try to do it during noon hour, so we didn't accuse of having our people off work, you know. We didn't get there until about 1 or 1:30, but everybody took a late lunch hour. They didn't go, and the place was packed. And it was that, I always, of all the places we had political rallies, by far my favorite was in the Rotunda of the state capitol. You didn't have to have all that many people to make it look jammed, and you always wanted a big crowd, but it just, the setting to me just was, it just kind of, and we always had a band playing John Philip's music. That was my favorite kind of music to get me pumped up. And so we went in there that day, and I just remember that place, people were hanging from the rafters, and they'd been waiting for 2 hours. They were still there. And it wasn't just all job holders or seekers. There were a lot of other people there, because we lived in Springfield, so a lot of our friends were there as well. And that rally was very uplifting. I mean, it kind of got the juices going. And from there we flew to Peoria and had another good rally, and then flew to Rockford. We might have had 7 rallies now that I think about it. We flew to Rockford, and then from Rockford we flew to the Quad Cities. And I think that one we had it near the Holiday Inn near the airport, because I remember they have a huge polar bear in that hotel, and we walked by the polar bear walking into our rally. Then we had to get to Chicago in time to make sure that we got on the WGN Evening News. We're going to do a live broadcast on WGN. Well, you want to do that because that goes all over the state. But we were running behind. Of course, needless to say, we'd had all these stops, and we just weren't quite on schedule. And we're sitting at the Quad City Airport, and they said, well, there's a delay getting into O'Hare.
You were going to O'Hare?
Yeah, we were going to fly, because we were going to, well, we had a jet. I mean, it was a regular
Well, I'm
airline.
surprised you wouldn't have gone to Meigs.
We were doing it there because that's where the rally was.
Okay.
In the suburbs, and it was in Rosemont. And but anyway, I just remember that they said, well, you're going to be held on the ground here in the Quad City probably for an hour. Well, one of our staff people, rather, who knows a little bit about flying and stuff, Sam Skinner was the Secretary of Transportation from Illinois. And so, and he was a guy we knew. The staffer got on, he took the microphone or the whatever from the pilot and said, said, we have spatial clearance from Secretary of State or Secretary of Transportation Samuel Skinner. And, he made this up. And there was a pause on the other end, and finally says, you have immediate clearance into O'Hare. We flew 6 months, or about a year later, the staffer, somebody put a letter together from, they got a letterhead from the Department of Transportation, or one of their agencies, saying that they were investigating someone use of, this guy was scared to death he was going to go to jail. But anyway, so we get into Rosemont, and a huge crowd there, and that was important because this was our big Chicago rally, and we had worked extra hard to get a lot of ethnic groups there, because that we knew was going to be an important part of the campaign. And I'll never forget, I mean, this is, I think my 7th stop, not my 6th at this point, and I was getting a little tired, but the crowd was just huge, and it got us all pumped up, and we had a lot of speakers there before I spoke, and I'm looking out in the audience, and over here we have Pakistanians for Edgar, and over here we have Indians for Edgar, Indians. And I thought, and well, as the night went along, they got pushed closer and closer together. And I had this vision that right when I got up to speak, they were going to be right next to it, and they were going to fight was going to break out between the Pakistanians and the Indians. And anyway, that didn't happen, but I told that to both groups later on during the next 3 years. So 4 years later, when I ran for governor, they had a joint Indian-Pakistans for a show that they could get together in Illinois in my campaign. But and we got there in time to do the live broadcast on WGN, and had a great rally there. And so anyway, the fly around we thought was very successful. I think everybody was on it, remembers that. It was quite an event, and the publicity was good. And as a result, the initial polls they had between Harding and I had a 15, 16-point lead, because I think we did a much better job of getting out of the starting gate than he did.
And this is months before the primary.
This is a year and 3 months before the election. But my theory was, we're both kind of known, and you want to get to people quickly and start out with a favorable impression, then it makes it a lot harder for you to lose their support later on. Now, that proved wrong. I mean, what I found out, and what I didn't appreciate when I started out, I knew that I had 95% name recognition. I think the Attorney General had 90% name recognition. My job approval was a little bigger than his. People had a stronger view. Secretary of State in Illinois is much more visible at that point than the Attorney General was. But it was all pretty shallow compared to what it takes for a governor. A governor, there needs to be a little more depth in people's perception than for Secretary of State or Attorney General. So while I thought people knew us and we got off to a good start, they still hadn't made up their mind. Even though they might have answered a poll one way or the other, they still weren't locked in, as we found out a year later. But it was off to a good start.
I know that the next phase is going to be this fly-around that you've already alluded to here. but I wonder if this is a good time to talk about the progression of your own political skills. Now, you're a guy who's going to be running for governor after Thompson has been holding the office for 14 years and arguably the most skilled politician campaigner that Illinois has seen for 100 years or so. Talk about critique your own campaigning style.
Well, I mean, I'm not Jim Thompson, and I knew I didn't want to be Jim. I mean, part of it, we knew we had to separate ourselves from Jim Thompson, and it had to be a little bit different. But at the same time, people expected kind of a backslapper, or somebody who was not too stiff, and I was probably a little stiff. But for the announcement, you knew that what was going to be on TV was going to be maybe 30 seconds to a minute and a half of what you said at your speech, and some cutaways on what you were doing as you went in and shaking hands. So of course I always walked in, shook hands with everybody, and there were pictures that appeared of me shaking hands with folks.
What were you wearing?
Suit,
Okay.
white shirt, tie. I mean, this was a very formal thing. Now, it got hot, and there are times I'd take that off, but when I did my speech, I think I can't remember if there was any time maybe when I just did it in shirt and tie, but no, there's a picture that we made up of the plane and Brenda and I getting off the plane that we gave to everybody and signed it to everybody that was on that fly around. There were probably about, all said and done, probably about 250 people at some point was on that plane, on that fly around. And it shows that I'm in a suit, and Brenda's dressed up, and the kids were kind of complaining they had to dress up too a little bit. They didn't have to wear suit ties, but they were dressed up. And but it was much more formal than going to the county fair or the state fair when you wear a polo shirt, things like that.
Tell me a little bit about the fly around for the next few months that you did in terms of campaigning and preparing the field.
Well, I spent a lot of time in the Chicago area, again, downtown Chicago, trying to line up financial support, business leaders. Neil Hartigan was from Chicago and was pretty well known in the social circle. His wife was very active socially, and a lot of politics is done in the social circles as well as the business circles. And one of the things, Neil was Irish, and there's a group of Irish businessmen, and even though they might be nominally Republicans, in Chicago, if you're a businessman, you've got to deal with Democrats because they run the city, always have. So I knew there were several of those businessmen who had a personal relationship with Neil Hartigan, and I had to try to wean as many of those as I could away. I didn't. Pat Ryan, who is a well-known insurance person, was a personal friend with Hartigan. The head of Commonwealth Edison was a personal friend of Hartigan. I never got those people. I spent some time with Pat Ryan, but it didn't. In the end, he supported Hartigan. Now, he might not have supported him as strongly as he would if I hadn't spent time with him. But again, a lot of the time was spent with business leaders. Also, we worked the ethnic community very hard too, because in Illinois, in 1990, and I think even today, the ethnic communities still play a major role in politics. It may be not as much as back in the mid-20th century when you made sure that every major ethnic group had a representation on the ballot, particularly the Democratic Party did. But still, a lot of people thought about their ethnic background before they thought about their political alliance. And
I want to make clear on this part, you're not just talking about the racial groups, but...
Oh, and I'm talking about the Poles, the Italians, the Germans, the Czechs, Lithuanians is an important thing in Illinois. Then you got into the Asians, but you had to deal with the Koreans, the Japanese, the Philippines. They're all separate. I mean, they didn't want to. And in the Hispanics, big difference between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. And then you had others, the Colombians and all. And I'd spent time as Secretary of State. One of the big advantages I had being the Secretary of State, getting ready to run for governor, I had 10 years to spend in those ethnic communities, and they knew me because I was the Secretary of State, and so they knew who that was. That gave me identity, but then I spent the time. So when I got ready to run for governor, I wasn't a new person. I mean, I had been very active in those communities, more so than really Neil Hartigan had been. A lot of those groups were, the Democrats everybody figured they were going to vote Democratic, so they kind of, I think, were taken for granted. I knew that I was going to have to go in there and, get to know those people and win them, particularly being a downstater and a Republican to boot. We, throughout the campaign, and then when we did that first fly-around announcement, a lot of the groups we had, particularly in the Chicago area, were ethnic groups that we had been working on for several years. So, but again, in those early weeks of the campaign, I needed to get out and about and make sure we had as many of those people involved as we could. But the main concern early on was putting together and raising the money. I mean, because you knew it was going to cost several millions of dollars, and that was kind of the major concern. And I had to put together my campaign structure. Now, I didn't have a campaign manager yet. I had hoped to get Carter Hendren, who had run a campaign for me when I first ran for Secretary of State, but he hadn't signed on yet. And we did the fly-around. He still wasn't signed on. He did go on the fly-around, but he was there kind of as an observer more than as a participant. And so I had to get him agreed to do that. I needed a finance chairman.
What if we can put up the slide that's got your campaign staff on there, at least the big players
Okay.
there?
I pretty much had everybody in place except Carter. Mike Lawrence was already my press secretary. Don Sipple had done media for me. As I'd talked to him. He hadn't done media, I guess, in my Secretary of State race, but I'd talked to him before, and he was going to do it. Bob Teeters had been my pollster. He'd been Thompson's posters. He was George Bush pollster. No longer was pollster. By that point, he didn't want to be a pollster. He wanted to be a consultant. Now, don't ask me what consultants do except charge you money, and I never. But the guy that had been his assistant, Steeper. Is it Don Steeper? Not Don. Anyway, his name was Steeper, and he was my pollster. And then my media guy was Sipple. So you had two guys with S's, and it used to get people a little confused. Don Rose had done some media stuff for me in the past. He was very connected with the kind of the independent group in Chicago and also the south side of Chicago. And he was a consultant in this campaign as well. He didn't do the media for the most part. Sipple did all the media. But Carter, he agreed to come on. But then I needed to find a finance chairman, and I got a businessman in Chicago named Carl Bays, and he had chaired a major fundraiser for me when I first ran for Secretary of State, and he was very active in the business community, which is important. You wanted somebody who knew all the CEOs, so when they made the calls, that they'd take their calls and they'd know him. He agreed to do it, and now, unfortunately, a few weeks later, or maybe it's a few months later, we were ready to have our first big fundraiser, and he had a heart attack and died the day of our fundraiser, and we had to cancel our fundraiser. So even though I felt good I had that in place, we had to start back over there. But as I said, the first few weeks, months were really trying to put the organization together to get out and talk to a lot of folks one-on-one. There weren't many campaign events. I mean, I still was Secretary of State, and I would do things there. And we didn't put out any position papers yet, though early on. In fact, it was when I was still in Vail. I did a radio program with Bill Cameron. He's now on WLS radio, but back then he was on WMAQ radio. And I remember it was about three days after Thompson announced he wasn't going to run. It was obvious I was going to be a candidate. I did a Sunday morning program or something with him, and he raised the question, well, what's your position on the temporary income tax? Are you for making that permanent or not? And I think he expected me to just kind of waffle and not take a position or maybe be against it. And I said, well, I think we got to make it permanent. And he was dumbfounded because here's probably going to turn out to be the biggest issue in the campaign.
What time frame roughly was this?
This is 3 days after Thompson announced he wasn't going to run, and about 2 weeks before I even announced I was going to run. So, I mean, and he said, do I understand you? He says, you're a candidate, you're really being that candid with it? You're not going to beat around the bush? And I said, no. And he said, well, I really admire that. But he admired it, but a lot of Republicans back in Illinois had heart failure over it. But it didn't get all that much play, but people kind of knew. But I'd always been my position on that, so I thought no reason to beat around the bush, just get it out now and get it over with. And so that position I had taken, though, as I said, it hadn't got a huge coverage, but the insiders knew it, and the party folks were rolling their eyes. And
well, for those who can't remember the specifics, I think the specifics for the surcharge was in 1989, the state needed more money. Thompson was able to push this through the legislature.
Now, Thompson didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There's a myth on that. No, it was Mike Madigan.
Okay.
Mike Madigan had he went down to do a fundraiser in Effingham for a state rep, and it's kind of, they say it's like Paul on the road to Damascus. Madigan had never been for it. He hadn't pushed an income tax, didn't care, schools needed more money, didn't bother him too much. But when he went down to Effingham, and that's all they were talking about down there, and the state rep was, Hartke was his name, he went down to his fundraiser. Madigan came back from there, and then he, in a 24-hour period, he sprung on the General Assembly a temporary income tax for education and local government. Also, Mayor Daley had just been elected, and he wanted money, and this was a way he could get money for Daley, but get downstaters to vote for it too, because it had education. And in 24 hours, he pushed it through the legislature. Thompson did sign it, but he didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, there are very few Republicans, if any, that voted for it.
So it took it from 2.5% to 3% for personal income tax, 4 to 4.8% for corporate.
Right.
And you already mentioned half of it was designated to education and half to local government.
Yeah, none of it really went in the state, except you want to say the money that went to education. And it was to expire in 2 years. That was the first year after the new governor took office. So it's an understandable question, Governor. If you're the governor, what are you going to do about? Well, almost everyone in that election was running opposed to making the surcharge permanent. Even Madigan wasn't talking about making permanent, you know. So right out of the bat, I take a position on it. Hartigan didn't take a position for almost a year. So I took that position, and but for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of issues being talked about out there. There was a little bit of personalities being talked about. Now, a lot of people thought early on that I looked like I might win easily. One, we'd had a Republican governor for 14 years. A lot of the pundits didn't realize there was a huge, we want change out there. They just figured, well, the Republicans have it, they'll probably hold on to it. And also, a lot of them didn't think Hartigan would be that tough a candidate because he'd backed out 4 years before when he was going to run for governor, and Madigan put pressure on him and who didn't like him, and he got Adlai Stevenson to run again, and then Hartigan caved and withdrew, and so he got a rap even from members of his own party that there wasn't enough steel there, you know. And now I didn't agree. I thought he knew this was his last shot. Yeah, I knew he had good name recognition downstate from his time as lieutenant governor when Dan Walker had been governor, and they didn't get along, and so he was always fighting Walker, but he was very visible. Not as Attorney General, because then Attorney General wasn't as visible as it is today, but because he had been Lieutenant Governor. And I'd also seen Paul Simon get elected U.S. Senator to a great extent because people knew him not as a congressman, but they remember him as Lieutenant Governor. So I thought he would be a tough candidate, and I thought he really wanted it because I knew him. We spent time together, and I knew this. He was like me. This was, this is what you want to do. This is your one shot. So I thought he'd be the toughest candidate. But there were some out there that didn't think he would be that difficult. And those early poll numbers with me with a pretty big lead, a lot of people just said, well, this won't be that tough a race. Well, as it moved along, it got much tighter, and I think he surprised a lot of people, and I thought and I think everybody would agree, ran an excellent campaign. It was a good campaigner.
I wanted to ask you something you mentioned just a few minutes ago. It was a year, though, before he came out on the issue of the surcharge. I imagine that the media was hounding him unbelievably to come out in one way or another.
There were. But if you don't take a position, sometimes it's easier. I mean, at least they couldn't put you one way or the other. Because one of the reasons was on the surtax, and we'll talk about, because surtax was the biggest issue in this case. The biggest issue was the issue of change. People wanted change. After 14 years of one party and Jim Thompson, they wanted change. And so I, as a candidate, had to convince people I was a change, even though I'm a Republican and, I'm not an enemy of Jim Ryan. And
Jim Thompson.
Jim Thompson. And Neil Hartigan kept hammering away that he was change. So change was a huge issue. The other issue was the surtax, taxes in general. And to compound that was about probably sometime in October, maybe early October, late September, I was doing a press conference in Chicago as Secretary of State on some issue, which the media up there didn't care a bit about. And when I got done, we started talking about political issues. Then we just the conference kind of ended, but we kept talking. Something I hadn't learned yet. Don't talk when you don't have to. So I remember that Bob Crawford from BBM Radio was there, and he said something about, we got to do something about school funding. The property tax is really bad. And I said, no, I agree. I said, I think the property tax is antiquated, and we ought to rely more on the income tax. And he said, oh, yeah. And everybody, it was just kind of discussion. Well, there was a new reporter for the Tribune who hadn't sat through these discussions before. And he thought, boy, I've got a great story. Edgar's for raising the income tax even more to help schools so we can lower property taxes. So the next morning, the banner headline in the Chicago Tribune, Edgar for more income tax increase. Not just making the surtax permanent, this guy wants to raise it even more. Well, needless to say, the party folks just went out of their minds. Even my friend said, did I read that right? And I said, that was, I've always, and throughout my legislative career and everything, I've always said I favor income tax over property tax when it comes to funding school. I think it's a better source. And that's really what we were having. It wasn't like I'm going to propose an increase in the income tax for schools in addition to the surtax. But the headline was there. And so that, among party folks, got them all real excited about how much taxes. And taxes throughout the campaign was probably, besides change, was the number one issue out there. And so as this campaign progressed, we spent a lot of times talking about taxes, be they income tax, surtax, or property taxes.
Had any of the journalists done enough digging to find out that as a legislator running for back, I guess, 74, that was one of the issues that you were advocating at that time?
Well, I don't know if you'd find out, but they'd find that I proposed a local school income tax.
Yeah,
the first year I was a state
about.
legislator, it was in 1977, yeah. And I think they did dig into that, but it's, again, I think the AP the AP often, they're kind of lazy, they take their stories off what their major papers, right, they rewrite it, and they wrote the Tribune story, and that appeared around the state about me wanting more of an income tax increase than just making the surtax permanent. So needless to say, create a little bit of a crisis in our campaign. So that was a huge issue. And then toward the latter part of October, because filing wasn't until December then, you started to hear some grumbling from the right. Now, we always worried about somebody from the right, not on the tax issue, but on the social issues. I'm pro-choice and issues like that. And sure enough, we had a guy we had other people talking about it, but finally somebody surfaced to run, a person named Steve Baer was his name. And he attacked me on my tax policy, but really all his support came from the religious right. It didn't generate all that many votes on the tax issue, but on the abortion issue in particular, that's where a lot of their support. And when the primary came about, you could see where his votes came from were in areas where there were a larger percent of fundamentalists. And we also know they didn't have much money. They didn't spend money on television, but they campaigned putting flyers at churches and things and church groups. So, but that put me a little bit on the defensive throughout the campaign on the issue of taxes and how I handle it. So, but I didn't back off on the surtax, and I did say that I wasn't going to raise any other taxes. I wanted to make the surtax permanent, but other than that, I was for holding the line on taxes. Now, at that point, nobody thought we'd even get the surtax.
Were you reluctant to say that you wanted to hold off on any other kind of taxation?
Not really, because I thought I was going to use up all my capital just trying to get the surtax permanent. That to me, because at that point you had almost every legislator, even those who voted for the temporary tax, to say, we're not going to make it permanent. We're for 2 years, that's enough. As Neil Hartigan later would say, just cut the waste out of government. And so, but the other big issue out there in the suburbs particularly were property taxes. Because at that point you had a huge amount of inflation. House prices kept jumping. Well, that meant their property tax kept jumping. But people weren't selling their houses, but their property tax bill was going up. And the schools and all were taking that money. So a lot of interest out there. A lot of them wanted rollbacks, freezes. And so in the primary, we developed a proposal that was a tax cap. Probably a misnomer. It was a limit on how much property taxes could go up. And I spent a lot of time working on that with staff and people, and coming up, and made that proposal probably in January. It seemed like it was before the primary. And we wanted to do it in the primary because we wanted to kind of dampen this concern about the income tax, because we thought the property tax issue was just as important, if not more so, in the suburbs where most of the Republican primary votes were. So timing-wise, but we also thought this was an issue we needed to be up front on because people wanted to do something on property taxes. Interesting, we didn't get a lot of press off that. People didn't take it serious. They thought it never happened. Now, 2 years later, it was law, much to the surprise to everybody. But that was an important thing for us to get out there and to talk about, to try to get the talk off of income tax and talk more about property tax relief, which I think did help. But again, I don't think a lot of the pundits and the insiders really thought it would ever happen until it happened.
In the early, once you get past the beginning of the year, was your focus on Bear, or was it focus on the general election?
I never focused on him. In fact, we kind of ignored him. Part of that was strategy. He didn't have any money, and we didn't want to give him any platform, so we wouldn't agree to debate or anything like that. We just ignored him. And most of what I was concentrating on was the general election. Now, the difficulty with that is the general election, you need to be in the middle, and here you're getting attacked in the primary from the right. And so you wanted to kind of dampen that, but at the same time, you didn't want to do something that was going to harm you in the general election, because to me that was going to be, I knew I was going to win the primary. Now, how much, I didn't know, but I knew I was going to win the primary, but I wasn't sure about the general election. So throughout that period, probably I didn't worry as much about the primary as maybe some of my people did. But we also knew we wanted to keep that vote down, because the more vote he got would be kind of embarrassing to us. Now, Hartigan didn't have any primary opposition, so he could just be a statesman, as we said, and there wasn't anybody, attacking him. But we got a lot of attack from Bear publicly about taxes. Now, publicly he didn't talk about abortion much. Privately, that's what they talked about, and that's what
Well, I was curious about how you would address the anti-abortion groups.
I didn't. I just didn't go there.
Okay.
I mean, you'd go to groups, and there would be some people in there who were right to life and some pro-choice. It wasn't an issue that I usually brought up, but my position was clear. I mean, I had always been pro-choice and had no hesitancy about that position. I did think you ought to have parental notification. I thought you needed to have, there's certain restrictions, but on the choice for particularly an adult woman, that was her decision.
How about the issue of state support for abortions?
My argument that was a health issue, and you shouldn't deny poor people the same option that wealthy people have.
So what you're saying is you did adjust your message a little bit.
Didn't adjust it. That's always been my position. It's just that this, as a state rep, nobody really cared that much. Secretary of State, we just ignored the issue because I said it had nothing to do with the office. As governor, then I had to kind of flush out a little more exactly. You got asked not just question A on that, you got question B and C. There wasn't anything that I changed. It was just clarify or explaining where I was.
Okay. And when I said that, I wasn't just addressing the abortion issue. I wasn't clear enough on that. But you said you needed to run a little bit to the right on the overall issues during the primary
Well, that's
campaign.
the traditional, but I didn't want to do that because, first of all, I wanted to make sure wherever I was, because there was a lot of feeling that past governors maybe had said one thing and done something else. I wanted to be very clear whatever I said was where I was going to be, because I thought the worst thing you could do, and Hartigan too, he had changed his position on abortion. He had been right to life, then he became pro-choice when he became a candidate for governor, and some other things. So I was very conscious that I was maybe slow to take a position, but when I took it, I stuck with it, because I thought that was extremely important.
Did you ever have a moment when you thought, well, maybe there's more to this Bears campaign than we had anticipated?
No. Actually, when he got his vote, I think, what did he end up getting, 35% of the vote?
He got, you got 60%, and the primary election is March 20th.
Yeah.
You got 60%, he got 34%.
Yeah. That was more than we thought he would get, but there was a low turnout, and we knew turnout was going to affect that percentage. Polls were showing maybe he only was going to get 10%. Well, polls in a primary can be very misleading, and when you have a low turnout, and those church folks came out in certain. I lost some counties, where they're very strong, and they came out in big numbers, whereas nobody got too excited of the general public about that primary. There wasn't a whole lot of excitement on either side, so the turnout wasn't very large. But it did cause a problem because people say, oh, this is a lot closer than we thought. Well, that's because they were looking at these polls saying it was going to be 90-10, and instead it was 60. And if you put the two candidates, we had another guy who's a libertarian, basically. I think his name was Dr. Baker. I can't remember his last name. He was a doctor. Anyway, he got the remainder. I think the 6. Well, you know, you had. I think you said 34 and
34 for Bear.
Yeah, and I got 60. I think he got 6%. But he was more on the conservative issues other than the social issues, whereas Bear was really the social issue was his drive. And again, in a small turnout in a Republican primary, that can be a factor. It was not the determining factor, but the only problem it caused me, fortunately, I did not pull it in my answer. I didn't, take positions I had to reverse in the general election, but it did cause some embarrassment, and people said, well, Ed, you're going to have a problem with the right in the general election, and they're not as strong as we thought. Whereas Hartigan had no problems, and he came out after the primary. He announced, he kicked off his campaign, I guess, like a few days after the primary. Well, there was no negatives there, where I was still dealing with this. Well, you only got 60% of the primary vote,
But you had to spend no money on campaign ads for the primary.
No, we spent some on ads. We ran some ads, but that didn't bother me. I think that still helps for the general. I mean, again, you're still in this process of, on television, Democrats and independents watch those ads just as much as Republicans do. So I didn't worry as much as some people say, oh, it's terrible to spend money in a primary. I don't agree with that, particularly for a non-incumbent candidate. I think it's beneficial. Now, you hope you don't get beat up too much by your own party. Now, it turned out, publicly they hit me on taxes, and the Democrats then picked up that theme in the fall. And I think used it effectively, and there's no doubt I got probably beat up a little bit in the primary that made that a more effective, credible issue in the fall. But the fact that I didn't change any positions and we began to roll out some positions that I think we continued saying the same thing in the fall campaign as we said in the primary. One of the things that happened early on that you realize in a primary and even in the election itself, you get in this and you think, boy, I've got to explain to people where I am on the big issues and show people that I understand government and I've got plans. I kept hearing this word vision. What's your vision? That's the most overrated, phony word I've ever heard in a campaign.
But that was always the critique against George Bush.
Yeah, well, and I know it. It was, it's not a vision. You get in there as governor, you don't have a chance. You got to react. You got to deal with crisis. How are you going to manage? That should be the question. Maybe a president a little more, but you've got to have some priorities. But this vision thing, most of those things that candidates talk about their vision is something some staffer thought up, so they've got something to talk about it. And most of those issues you talk about in a campaign like that, they go away after the election. Then you got to really worry about the real issues. But we decided early on we wanted to put out position papers and demonstrate to people that I had a grasp about government and I would be an effective governor. And so we did the first position paper was going to be on the war on drugs. And we decided we were going to do that at the Chicago Rotary Club in downtown Chicago. It was on a Wednesday at noon. We thought that'd be, Chicago downtown, noon, all the Chicago media, it's easy for them to cover, and we could, unveil our first position paper on a very important issue at that point, as it is now, even more so then, concerns about the war against drugs and all. So, and I have a prepared speech, which I very seldom ever did. But we had a prepared speech. We had the press releases with the position paper, everything there for the media. And I show up at 12 o'clock downtown Rotary, and this is the first Rotary Club in the world, it's a big deal. I go in there, and one media guy shows up. It was the political reporter from the Chicago Tribune, Tom Hardy at the time, who years later was my press secretary, but at that point he was the political guy. But he didn't come because I was doing a position on drugs. He just came to see how the campaign was going. He hadn't been around me for a few weeks, and he just wanted to see. Now, he wrote a good story. It appeared on the obituary page of the Tribune. And we thought, well, that's terrible. Here's a major position. It's obvious I'm going to be the Republican candidate for governor, and I got a good chance of being governor. and here's a major issue, and I'm talking the issues. That's what they always want you to do, talk on issues. And nobody covered, except a guy accidentally covered me. And then they bury the story. So the next issue we decide we're going to unveil is my position on environment. Well, we decided, well, maybe, you know, we wanted Chicago television. That's what you're always trying to get. So we thought, well, maybe we need visuals. You know, just a bunch of white men sitting around in suits doesn't do anything for them. And that's basically what Chicago Rotary at that point, I don't think they had women in yet. And so we need visuals. So we'll do the environmental thing on the Chicago River. Well, maybe Wednesday at noon, there's too much going on in Chicago, and state government's not their top priority. They'd be more concerned about a dogfight on State Madison, as the old saying was, than they would be what's going on in Springfield. So we'll do it on a Saturday morning when there's not much going on. Now, we don't want to do it too early because we know TV folks don't get up early. And so we decided to do it at 11 o'clock on Saturday at the Chicago River. And it was a beautiful spring day. We're down there, and I've got charts, you know, instead of just reading, I got charts, colored charts and all this and that. We go down there, nobody shows up. Well, you realize you can talk issues all you want, but they won't cover it. That's why candidates do goofy things in campaign, because media doesn't cover issues because they're kind of dull and boring to some people. I mean, good government is dull, and that's why it doesn't get good coverage. So we learned pretty quickly, you know, you can put out these position papers and talk this, but outside of a few interest groups, media doesn't care. They're not going to give you the coverage. That's why, fast forward to the end of the campaign, the last weekend of the campaign, I'm doing the final swing through the suburbs, and it's tight. And so this is an important thing. What do? I spend the whole day Sunday, the last big campaigning day, holding up a waffle, a frozen waffle. And I said, if my opponent's elected, this will be the state seal, because he waffles on every issue, because he had flip-flop and all this stuff. I remember the front page of the Chicago Tribune the next day in the Sun-Times, colored picture of me holding a waffle. Lead story on the 6 o'clock news on Sunday night in Chicago television, me holding up a waffle. Now, is that good government? No, but that's effective campaigning, unfortunately, because they don't care about position papers. So anyway, but I first learned that in the primary, that it's going to be hard to talk about what you think the issues are and do it. A lot of it is what comes up in a campaign. Something will happen, and that'll get the media going, then you have to be ready to respond to that. Maybe your opponent criticizes you, something you've got to be able to respond to that. But putting out issues, you got to do it, but it doesn't get you much coverage. And if you do a lot of it, then they say, boy, this is a dull candidate. And then when you don't do it, the media says, well, why don't they talk about the issues? Well, we don't talk about the issues because they don't cover it. And in a campaign, what you do is what you think will get you free coverage, because that's the name of the game. You're out there trying to get in front of the public, and the best way to get in front of a public the size of the state of Illinois is from television. And you can buy commercials, but better if you can get free television on the news, and it's positive. So that's why you spend a lot of time trying to think that. And you do want to respond to issues, and you want to be careful as you respond on issues that you not only sound intelligent, but you don't make a lot of folks mad at you. And you get a lot of questionnaires. During this period, we're getting all these questionnaires from all these groups. Well, you want to be careful how you answered those, because they'd make those public, and your opponent would find some sentence that sounds kind of strange, and all of a sudden that'd be a commercial.
Is it a rule of thumb that you want to avoid being any more specific than you have to be?
Well, if you can. But there's sometimes, I mean, you know, you've taken positions, or you know what your position is, or you know what that group's want, and you can take a position and maybe it's not going to be a negative, but you always, those questionnaires would come back to haunt you more times than it ever help you. You'd have questionnaires maybe as a state rep you'd filled out 20 years before somebody would find. One of the disadvantages I had in that campaign, I had been a state legislator, which meant I'd voted on hundreds of bills.
You had a record.
I had a record. He had never been a legislator. Outside of a few attorney general's opinion, which he didn't do many of, he didn't really have a record that you could go at. And you know, you could go back and find something and make a mountain out of a molehill. I think it's worse today than it was then, but that was something you always worried about in a campaign. But a lot of the campaigning, particularly in the first 6 months of the last part of 1989 and into 1990, you'd be out every day doing things, but you wouldn't get all that much coverage. There wasn't all that much interest yet because even in the primary there wasn't all that much interest because it was so early.
I wanted to go back and ask you a couple more specific questions about your campaign staff, and start with Carter Hendren. I assume that once you get past the primary, probably in the primary season, he is on board by that
He
time.
came on board, actually came on, I think he was on board by, if not September, by October before.
Why did you select Carter Hendren?
Well, Carter had run my campaign when I ran for Secretary of State in 1982. He actually, when he was a student at Eastern, had worked on my first campaign for state representative that I lost in 1974 in the primary.
But what are the skills that he was bringing to the job?
He's one of the few people who had run a successful or had run a statewide campaign on the Republican side in the state. He ran, not only ran my campaign in 82, but then he ran Percy's campaign in 84. Now Percy didn't win, but Carter ran a good campaign. It was close, and he had experience of running a statewide campaign, which is very important because Illinois is, I don't think you, now sometimes they'll bring people from out of state in to run the campaign. I would much rather have somebody from Illinois that understands Illinois. Carter also had worked in the legislature. He was working for Pate Phillip, the Senate leader, and that gave him an understanding. He'd worked a lot of legislative campaigns, so he knew the grassroots, he knew the nuts and bolts of a campaign. That's what you want in a campaign manager, somebody that knows the players, knows the nuts and bolts, knows the, kind of who to believe and who not to believe. And, there are a lot of people he met when he got involved in my campaign for governor that he didn't know before, but there are a lot of folks he already knew, and I thought that was helpful. He also brought credibility because particularly Senate Republicans, they trusted him and they liked him. One of the things in his campaign that made it interesting, why I think it's a classic, Hartigan had his detractors in the Democratic side, and I had my detractors on the Republican side. I don't think Pate Phillip necessarily loved me. I mean, he was very conservative. I was more moderate to liberal. We different lifestyles and all, but he wanted me to win because of redistricting. Same thing on the Democratic side. Mike Madigan did not like Neil Hartigan. I mean, he kept him off the ballot 4 years before, and they had kind of been competitive, young guys coming up the Democratic. But he thought in 1990 that Neil Hartigan was the strongest candidate, and the reason he wanted a Democratic governor wasn't philosophical. He wanted a Democrat to sign the map. So from the Democrats and the Republican legislators' side view, the most important thing was to have a governor of our party in to protect us on redistricting. I had a lot of conservative Republicans in the end that supported me, not because they were excited about me, but because they figured, well, I'd rather have a Republican governor that veto a Democratic map than have a Democratic governor sign a Democratic map, and we'll be in the minority forever in the legislature. That was a huge factor in this election as far as support and why the election really did fall on party lines. I mean, there were Democrats who probably, and even one of the groups we worked hard on, we didn't do all that well with, was labor unions. We'd have probably done a lot better with labor unions because Thompson had done pretty decent with labor unions. But redistricting was not an issue when he got their support. My year, that was the issue. That's one of the undertones of the whole campaign was the map and which party is going to have the governor's office, because the Republicans probably knew they probably weren't going to get control of the legislature, but they would have somebody to veto the map. The Democrats knew if they could get the governor's office, chances are they were going to get the map the way they wanted it. So that was a huge factor in this campaign that made it different from some other elections in the past.
Another one of your campaign staff, and somebody who's going to be very important throughout the administration, is Mike Lawrence. What was it about Mike Lawrence that so appealed to you?
Well, Mike Lawrence at that time was my press secretary as Secretary of State. Now, he'd been that for a couple of years. Before that, he'd been a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, and before that for what is now the Lee newspaper. I guess it was Lee then too, a chain of downstate newspapers. Mike was probably one of the most respected people in the press room. And so when he came with me, he brought that credibility that was very helpful to me as Secretary of State, but more importantly, as a candidate for governor and later as governor. He was also a few years older than I was. So he was in a little easier position to kind of in so many words, tell me, Governor, you can't, or at that point, Secretary, you can't do that. That's foolish. He did it in a nice way, and he continued to do that. But he'd been around state government. He knew it well. He knew the media well. He was well thought of, even in Chicago, even though he had primarily been a downstate newsman. They knew him in Chicago, and they respect him. And so it was very important to have your media person, someone that had credibility, and also someone who understood, in his case, state government. He knew people in all the agencies, and he knew a lot of the history and where a lot of the bodies were buried. And so he was very helpful on policy development as well as dealing with the media.
I've often heard people describe the nature of that relationship between the two of you as that, especially during your years as governor, he was probably your most important advisor, or in that inner circle. Would you characterize it at that
I think
time?
we all, I described, and I think most of my staff would, as the conscience of the administration. I mean, he was the guy that usually, if I'd have a wild idea or some staff guy'd have a wild idea, as happens in government, he would kind of bring everybody back to reality or say you can't do that. Now, sometimes he would be a little too far that way, and I'd overrule him. But I never made any major decision without his input. And I think he was extremely respected by all the staffers. I mean, I'm sure many of the staffers, because he could have a temper, and we all do, and he'd get in his moods, and he'd get down on somebody. But I think he's very well respected. But one of the things that helped me, and when I went for governor, I had a lot of the people that were with me as Secretary of State. And that continuity made me feel more comfortable, because here you're relying on these people to help you. This is your career. To them, it's just a job, maybe, but to you, it's your career. So it's very important that you have confidence in your staff, and I had confidence in my staff because I'd worked with him for a long time, and that helps, particularly when you get in the crux of a campaign right down to the wire and it's close, and you know everything you do, any little thing might swing the election one way or the other. You want to make sure that you've got people you can depend on. So Mike and many of the Carter, Al Grossball, who kind of was left back running the shop while I was out running
In the
for
Secretary of State office.
for governor. I mean, George Fleshley, who was very active with a lot of the sportsman group and downstate groups. Mark Peterson, who worked the ethnic community. These were people that I had worked for me for years. I had confidence in, and who I thought did an excellent job and had my interest as their number one priority. So whenever you run for office, you've got to have a team, but you got to have a team you feel comfortable with and that you will listen to. Now, I used to argue with them. They'd tell me you got to do this, and I don't want to do that. That's crazy. Usually in the end, I'd do it. Now, usually we'd modify it, and I never did anything that I didn't believe in, or I had certain. If I'd have taken a vote among my staff, they would not have voted for me for making the surtax permanent and some other things, but they knew that was me, and they wanted that. One of the things that we have not talked about, and it happened early in the campaign, something that Republicans have always done, Democrats very seldom do it, is pick your running mate. We have a terrible thing in the Illinois statute. The lieutenant governor and the governor don't run together in the primary. They run together in the general election, but in the primary, somebody can file for lieutenant governor who the candidate for governor doesn't like, but they're elected separately. And we've had the case of
Dan Walker is the
Neil
classic.
Hartigan and Dan Walker. You had, and this was after the new Constitution, they thought they'd fixed it because in the old Constitution, you could have a Democratic governor, or in the case we had Dick Ogilvy, a Republican governor, and Paul Simon, a Democratic lieutenant governor. They thought they'd taken care of that because they said, well, you got to run together in the general election. But it didn't say you have to run together in a primary, or the governor picks his running mate after he's nominated, like they do at the national level. So Thompson did not pick his running mate the first time he ran, but from then on he did. And I thought it was important that I pick my running mate because, one, I wanted to make sure I had somebody that was compatible. We'd just gone through 2 years before where Adlai Stevenson picked somebody, but he didn't push him hard enough, and they had the LaRouche. And I guess that was 4 years before.
86.
4 years before, yeah. And I didn't, you don't want that to happen, but also I didn't want somebody that I was going to be at loggerheads with. And I wanted somebody who, if something happened to me, they could step in and there'd be continuity. It wouldn't be I never was a subscriber that if you're a moderate, then you need a very conservative. to put the ticket. I think you ought to have somebody that's pretty compatible to your point of view. Now, I think you ought to have geographic balance, which I did. But so after we made the announcement and got going, the next big decision really was who's going to be my running mate. And I had several people interested because, again, it looked like there was a good chance I could get elected governor. And people thought, well, this would be a good place to be. And there were
a nice stepping stone.
Yeah. Though it turned out, I think everybody I talked to was older than me. Of course, I was kind of young. I was 43 when I announced. But there were 4 people that I talked to. Aldo DeAngelis, who is a senator from the south suburbs, a moderate Republican. Lolita Dickerson, who is a state rep from the same area, a moderate. And I thought it'd be nice to have a woman, but I wasn't that concerned because Lynn Martin was going to run for the U.S. Senate against Paul Simon. She was a congresswoman from Rockford area. And so that'd be the top of the ballot, and there'd be a woman. I always ran well with women. I had always ran ahead of women of any other Republican when I'd run for Secretary of State. And the polls showed that I was doing fine with women. So it wasn't like I had to have a woman unless I found one that I felt comfortable, and that was the best candidate. Then Judy Bart Topinka, I talked with her. And now I have to say, Judy, probably when she ran for governor years later, was much more compatible in my position, I thought, than when she was back then. She was a little, I wasn't sure about, she was a little more, Judy's always been flamboyant, which wasn't quite my style, but she was a good campaigner, and she's from the west suburbs. We knew we wanted somebody from the suburbs because I'm the downstater. We didn't need 2 downstaters. And then Bob Custra. Bob had originally said he wanted to run for controller, and he'd started going around the state during the preceding year during Lincoln Day dinners, talking about running maybe for controller. He wanted to run for statewide office. And one night I was in the Jersey County Lincoln Day dinner, and he was there too. And we hadn't been at the same places. Usually they didn't like to go where I was because I got to be the main speaker, because everybody thought, he'll be the candidate for governor, and they would rather be the big, well, it turned out for some reason he was in Jersey County when I was, and I heard him talk, and I thought he did a great job. And I asked him later, I said, yeah, that was really good. I said, would you be interested in something other than controller? And he said, well, I might be. So when it came time, he was one that
He knew what you were fishing for at the time?
Well, he knew, and he thought running for controller is a lonely job. I mean, that's a tough thing. Nobody gives you money, and you're out there. If you can hook on to the guy who's going to be the gubernatorial candidate, that's a lot better place to be. So then a few months later, when I became a candidate, he's one I talked to. And again, I felt comfortable. Bob, I'd known him. We'd both been staffers years before. When he first got out of school, he'd worked in a house when I worked in the Senate as a staffer. He had his PhD. I mean, he was a university teacher when he wasn't a legislator. I felt comfortable with that. We probably agreed on a lot of issues. Now, he was interesting, though, right to life, and I was pro-choice. And I told him that's all right. I said, it'd be better probably if we were the same, but I don't want you to, I'm not going to keep you from being my running mate because of that issue, because I think there are a lot of things we're compatible about. So I picked him to be my running mate. And so the day we're going to announce it, I remember Mike Lawrence and I were flying in, and we're talking to him, and he says, on the abortion, he said, I think I'm going to change my position. We said, what? He said, well, no, I think maybe, this, I said, you don't have to do that. Well, unfortunately, he went ahead and it came out and he did it, and that was the whole story. Lieutenant Governor candidate flip-flops on that's what we wanted to hit Hartigan with. And then that just sent the religious right off the wall. They were mad at, they weren't mad at me because I'd always been pro-choice, but they really were mad at him. They felt he'd betrayed them because he had been all his right to life. And one of his main supporters was one of the big right to life, a guy named Tom Roser, not Jack Roser, but Tom Roser. And he really had always been one of Bob's main supporters, and he was furious, and I don't think he had a good thing to say about him afterwards. Well, that also stirred up a little bit of against Edgar. Now, they didn't run anybody against him, but it did stir him up. That I think helped fueled the fire. But putting that aside, Bob I thought was an excellent choice because I thought he was very articulate, very bright, and he was a very good campaigner. He was great at going out and getting crowds. He's a good stump speaker, and he'd get a crowd riled up. And
Did the two of you campaign together?
No, no. He was sent. I mean, that would be counterproductive. He'd go places I couldn't get to, and I'd be on the east side of the state. We'd have him on the west side of the state. Now he didn't like to fly, which was a little bit of a problem. I didn't know till later, but he spent a lot of time in a car going out, you know, talking to party groups and things, and was a very effective campaigner.
The other part of the campaign team that I wanted to return to was the question of financing and who took over the financing role. You mentioned that
Well, Carl
had
Bays,
passed
he was
away.
going to be, and he passed away. We didn't have anybody for a long time. We had people on the staff who worked on fundraising, but we had to rely on individual fundraising. We had a lot of, you could go every night to a fundraiser.
But I've heard that you weren't the guy who would like to pick up the phone and make the calls yourself.
Nope. I didn't like it. I never did it. I mean, I never asked anybody for a campaign contribution. The only time I ever did, and the whole time I ran for governor. Now, I'd go to fundraisers and shake hands, but I didn't call a guy and say, hey, I'd sure like some financial help from you. I just never did that, which was a luxury that most candidates don't get. Now, I had people on my campaign staff that did that with great regularity, but I didn't do it. The only person I ever asked, there was an individual who was a Democrat who supported me because I was pro-choice. His wife had, I'd gone to a pro-choice thing in the primary, which I just soon not go to, but I couldn't say no to him. But it wasn't really the publicity I wanted right then. But I went to this event, and there was a bunch of women in Chicago, many of them wealthy women, it turned out. And I was their candidate on the Republican primary. In fact, they never were real sure about Hartigan because he'd flip-flopped on that issue. So most of them were Democrats, but I was their candidate. And this woman said something to her husband. Her husband called and said, you know, my wife wants me to support you, and now my partner is going to support Neil Hartigan, but whatever my partner gives Hartigan, I'll give you. And this guy gave me, I think he gave me $50,000, which is a lot of money, in 1990. And I said, I appreciate it. And so the only time I ever called anybody was about a week before the end of the campaign. I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks, if you give a contribution over $10,000, you have to immediately report that within 24 hours to the State Board of Election. So somebody at the end of a campaign can't dump in a whole lot of money to influence the election without the public being aware of it. So this is about a week to go, and the campaign is nip and tuck. I mean, we're back and forth, and I get a call from Carter. Carter said, so-and-so's partner has just given Neil Hartigan $50,000. Now, none of us know this guy that you got this $50,000, but we need. And he says, I know you don't ask for money, but you're the only guy. You got to call him and ask him for $50,000. I said, all right. So I called the guy up and I said, you know, sorry to bother you, but you know, you told me your partner gave Neil Hartigan the other day another $50,000. He says, check will be in the mail. 24 hours later, we got the check. Never saw that guy. I ran into him one time at an Illinois basketball game the whole time I was governor. And he was my biggest contributor. But that's the only guy I ever asked, and that was for that last $50,000 because nobody knew him except me.
I have heard Bob Hickman's name mentioned as one of the people who was making calls for you, helping with the fundraising.
Bob Hickman was the staffer who was in charge of fundraising.
Okay.
He had headed up my Chicago office, knew a lot of people in Chicago. Former mayor of Charleston, somebody that had helped me when I first ran for state rep. I used to buy cars off of it.
Oh.
He was a car dealer in Charleston. He came to work for me when I became Secretary of State, and eventually went up to Chicago and headed up my Chicago office up there. And then when I ran for governor, switched over and started working on fundraising. And
Do you remember how much money you spent in the campaign?
$10 million. No, we spent a little more than $10 million because we raised $10 million. First time I ran, as we talked earlier, for state rep, when I lost, I ended up with a debt. So I was determined I wasn't going to do that for governor because I thought I could lose. And I was assured going in the last few days of the campaign that I had that much money. I had all my bills paid for. And I found out later that I didn't. I was about $500,000 over. So fortunately, I didn't know that till after I won. And when you win, you don't have a debt. You just got a cash flow problem. But we raised about $10 million, and so did Hartigan, and spent. All I said, he had more to spend because he got a lot of free labor stuff that I didn't get. But money was not a factor in the election because we both had about the same amount. I mean, that's why I go back to that election. We both had about the same amount of money. We both had the same amount of name recognition. I had a little more job approval going in, but it really didn't impact so much for governor. We both had our parties, maybe grudgingly, but we had our party's support, almost 100%. And it was about as even as you could be. Now, you come to the primary, and again, it was a disappointing night when we realized we were just going to get 60% when we'd been projected we'd get 80% probably. I wouldn't say I was shocked, I was just disappointed. Mm-hmm. The next day we were to be at a dinner for the new president of Poland, the first free Polish president. So I went out to Washington for that. I was a state dinner. That was my first state dinner, but of course, Bush was in the White House and they knew we had a lot of Poles in Illinois and this would be a good thing to have me to. And more importantly, probably Brenda sat next to John Sununu, who was chief of staff, and struck up a relationship there. I mentioned Bush a little bit in the primary. I had supported George Bush when he ran in '88. I think I told you that story earlier,
right,
about telling Bob Dole, no, I was going to be for George Bush. But Bush, for the most part, didn't take sides in primaries. But in this case, he did. He endorsed me in the primary. And Phyllis Schlafly was just furious. She was the head of Eagle Forum, a very conservative woman, and she was for Steve Bear. And she went out to see Lee Atwater, who was Bush's political operative. I think he was national chairman at that point. And because Atwater had come to Illinois, was coming to Illinois to say that he was for Edgar. And this was the best thing for the party. And she came in and just chewed on him, and he just said, that's how we're going to be, because he can win. And we want to win. And your guy can't win. And, it says, plus Edgar's been supportive of the president when he ran and stuff. But I remember Atwater told me, he said, she wasn't happy, but Atwater, he could just chew right back, But so the White House had tried to be, and they didn't get real involved. That was about all they did. But it was still a sign that here I'm approved by the president, which at that point he was still very popular, and at least among Republicans. And so that helped to some extent to kind of, again, give me credentials as a legitimate Republican, even if I do have some of these wild-eyed liberal tendencies on abortion and taxes and things like that. But the primary was not a fun night. And then after that, we went to Florida take a vacation. We were down there for a week. Well, the whole time I'm down there, Hartigan's then starting his campaign and getting all this media, and he's wonderful, and all the Democrats are united, and Republicans are still, split, and all this and that. Again, property tax is a big issue. And my staff wants me to say that I'm for making the surtax permanent, but I want to take that money and give it to property tax relief, at least the part that goes to local government. I said, well, I don't want to give all that. I said, I got to leave some for local government, but I want some of that, because I never promised it all for local government.
And that local government piece, wasn't that primarily there because of
Daley?
Daley?
Yeah. And, local government, they didn't need the money half as much as the state did, as we later learned. I mean, they were building things. But anyway, I knew that was I didn't know how bad the state was off, but I knew it wasn't in good shape. I didn't realize it was as bad as it was, or I probably wouldn't have run. I'd have probably just left the state. But I didn't want to give that up. And they just hammered away at me. They'd call me 3 times a day in Florida trying to get me to sign off on this press release. And they about had me, but I said, where's Lawrence? Well, Lawrence fortunately had gone to the restroom. Because Lawrence was kind of with me. But Carter and a guy named Mike Bellatier and Phil O'Connor, some guys, they were just fanatics on this, just beating away at me. I need to do this. I got to do something to revive the campaign because we came out of the primary bad. And we don't have momentum, blah, blah, blah. And our poll numbers were getting closer. And so I didn't want to do it, but I just wanted to stop bugging me. I just wanted some peace and quiet in Florida because I was trying to kind of get over the primary. And fortunately, I about ready to agree, but Lawrence wasn't there. And I said, well, not till Mike gets back. I don't want to do it. Well, Mike didn't get back for, I don't know what, we didn't talk again, but by that time, Mike had kind of felt even more like I did. I don't think this is a good idea. So fine, I just told him no. But if Florence hadn't gone to the restroom, we probably would have given it all away for property tax relief, which was a drop in the bucket. And we wouldn't have had anything to help the state kind of get out of the crisis we were going to find itself in. But we came back from the primary, after came back, and there was another poll that came out, and I still had a comfortable lead, which kind of quieted, because the legislators, they were all upset. Everybody was nervous about it. Now, that quieted things down, and then we went into the spring, and you didn't know how things were going because the legislative session was in and the media wasn't covering it. And we come into the summer. Now, all the time, I'm doing fundraising. Just all the time, I'm doing fundraising. People, almost every night, you'd meet a fundraiser. A lot of these were small fundraisers, and Hickman would do all kinds of, get people to put fundraisers together. I mean, they weren't the big fundraisers you would think of in politics. You have maybe a few of those, but most fundraising is done on little fundraisers, maybe 50 people, and maybe you get $30,000 for governor, and that's, you know, we tried not to go for less than $20,000 because just time-wise it didn't pay off, but they were from maybe 25 to 50,000, a lot of them. There weren't all that many over $100,000. And so you spent a lot of time doing that. But in that spring, again, we kept talking issues, working groups. Groups were beginning to endorse. The primary was over. Now, the AFL-CIO didn't wait to the primary. They endorsed Neil Hartigan before the primary. Sure. But one of the big groups was the IEA, the Illinois Education Association, the teachers union, downstate teachers union, suburban teachers union. It was probably the most important endorsement out there of any of the groups because they not only endorsed, they put people in the street, they put money in the camp, and they're pretty good politically.
And normally aligned with the Democrats, I would think.
More times than not, though they had endorsed Thompson, and
okay.
I'd had him as a state rep when I ran. I mean, they had endorsed some Republicans, but more times than not, they'd be with the Democrat. Well, to them, the big issue was the surtax. And Hartigan was trying to get their endorsement. I was too. And they had a council of 22 people. And I went and visited, I think, every one of those 22 people to try to.
Individually?
Individually, because that was that important. Now, there was a few I didn't get to or we knew that were going with Hartigan or whatever. But I spent a lot of my time meeting face-to-face with the people on that council. Mm-hmm. And first of all, the IAA wanted to be with the winner, as they proved when they endorsed George Ryan over Glenn Pashar, who was a member in 1998. But they also wanted somebody that was going to be sympathetic to their point of view. And while I didn't necessarily agree with all their positions on some of the work rules and things like that, on the big issue, on surtax, I was there. And Hartigan hadn't taken a position yet. He implied he might be there, but he never would tell them. And so
I would imagine that they were especially interested, that they would especially want to see that swap, that you put a cap on property tax.
Well, they didn't like that. They didn't like the property tax thing at all. They didn't like that, but they didn't think I'd really get it done. I mean, nobody thought that would really happen, but the surtax was the driving thing, probably more important than my suggestion of a property tax cap.
But there had always been a link between, okay, we're willing to raise income tax if we lower or put a cap on property tax.
Yeah, but that isn't what we were talking about here. Okay. They already had that surtax money. They were already spending that.
Okay.
So they weren't ready to drop property taxes for something they already had, but they wanted to keep it. So the biggest issue, the most visible issue to them wasn't property tax cap, though in hindsight they probably wish they'd have made it that. It was the surtax. And I was for it, making it permanent. Plus I had a record. I was also not for aid to parochial schools, which Hartigan, he's Irish Catholic, he had a record of being more that way. I wasn't, and I was pretty adamant on that. So outside of the property tax issue, which wasn't as important as the surtax at that point, I had a pretty good record for teachers.
How about Chicago school reform? Was that an issue at this time?
This is the IEA. You got to understand the IEA is not the Chicago Teachers Union. Chicago Teachers Union endorsed Hartigan in the primary for the general election. I mean, which I always thought was crazy because he'd never been for the surtax yet. Never did, but he wasn't even that. And I was. And they didn't even come in and endorse me in the Republican primary. They just didn't endorse. They just endorsed him in the primary for the general election. But the IEA was more important because the IFT, that's the Chicago's Teachers Union, they're automatically Democrat. They always are Democrat. I mean, and that's basically Chicago though. So, but the IEA is suburban and downstate, and so it's much more important in the political scheme. And it's also a possibility for a Republican to get. So, you know, we spent a lot of time, and Hartigan did too, I think, a lot of time on that group. And I think sometime midsummer they made their endorsement, and they endorsed me. And right after that, Hartigan came out against the surtax.
I wanted to ask you one more question, and I think we're going to take a break for a brief moment here and then pick up with a new tape. Give me your sense of Hartigan the man, Hartigan the political opponent. I mean, we've talked about him a lot, but I don't know that you've been quite that explicit.
I had known Neil Hartigan back when I was a staffer, and he was lieutenant governor on energy issues. We'd been allied. I'd worked for some senators who were allied with him against Walker and some of the House Republicans. Interesting. And, you know, he's a very, very friendly person. I mean, very personable. People, you know, he always is very congenial. I found out as Secretary of State there was an issue that came up that he was trying to do something that affected us, and we were on different sides, and legislature told us to get together, and we got together. He wasn't as much at the specifics, kind of like George Ryan in some ways, but much more affable, I think, than George Ryan. But he wasn't so much a detail guy. That wasn't his thing. He was you know, I don't want to say backslapping, but he was that kind of a speaker. He'd give a fire brimstone speech. Didn't come off as well on television, but, you know, boy, at a rally, he was really good at working a crowd up. He was a ward committeeman in Chicago and had, you know, those political skills. So, but as a person, I always found him to be very friendly. Even when we were running against each other, I mean, he never was nasty about things or anything like that. I mean, he always was very friendly. And after the election, he was very friendly. But as a candidate, I think, as I said earlier, I thought he'd be tough. A lot of people didn't, and he was tough. He turned out to be much more disciplined than people thought he'd be. He, you know, he worked harder than they thought he would. And I thought was, in 1990, it was as tough as anybody I could run against. I was glad he came out against the surtax. I really think if he'd have been for the surtax, that would have there wasn't a whole lot of difference between us. And I think that would have been to his advantage because I think he could have maybe held on and maybe picked up another editorial. He didn't have hardly any editorial. Chicago Sun-Times and Crane's Business are the only two papers in the state that endorsed him.
He could have run on the change issue much more strongly.
I think so. I think, you know, the teachers, the IEA endorsement is important, but teachers have got to follow it. If he'd have been for the surtax, there might have been more teachers that said, well, I'm still going to be for Hartigan. But the fact he was against it, I think, you know, hurt him. Now, it would have been tough in some ways for him to be for the surtax because in the fall of 90, right before Labor Day, late summer is better, they ran a series of commercials that really closed the gap in that race. And they didn't attack me, they attacked Thompson more in all the taxes. Thompson and the taxes, the Republicans, and implied I'm part of Thompson's machine or organization, and you know they went after Thompson and taxes because they documented all these taxes that had been, a lot of them were, you know, little taxes, but they counted up 10 million taxes, or not that many, but several hundred taxes been increased under Thompson when he said he wasn't going to raise taxes and things like that. And they really hit at that. And I think it was effective because people were worried about taxes, but also they were kind of, Thompson been in 14 years and people kind of want to change. And that reinforced that, and then I'm part of that. You know, the Democrats are pretty good at, I hated this, they called Big Jim and Little Jim. I hated that with a passion. You know, it wasn't as bad as being named Ryan, like Jim Ryan, right after George Ryan, but it still, I didn't like that. But also I knew that I needed to distance myself from Jim Thompson or I would get caught up in that change. And while Thompson people may be tired, there were positive things about Thompson that wouldn't transfer to me, but the negatives could on this change idea. And so I thought, I said, those commercials they ran in August were probably the most effective commercials maybe about in the campaign for them by far, because we went from about a 9-point lead to a 3-point lead, I think, or something. It got very close by Labor Day.
Well, let's take a break right now. This is a good place to break it off, and we'll get into the heat of the campaign and take a look at some polls and watch some commercials and get your response to all that. And some of the barbs going back and forth as well for the last part of the discussion. Thank
Okay.
you very much.